Hare Om Namaha. In the mid-80s, ISKCON, so-called ISKCON, was embroiled in contentiousness. Kali Yuga was having a field day amongst the various groups of argumentative and disturbed devotees trying to get over. The whole debacle was due to the Vic-karmic reactions that had been hammering the movement for its many deviations over the years. Kali Yuga saw that it was time for a change, similar to the big one that went down in the spring of 1978. Superficially, there appeared to be two factions vying for institutional supremacy. That was that those two factions were acknowledged as the Guru Reform Movement versus the Zonals. The Reformists were composed of malcontents opposed to the opulent worship of the air quotes ISKCON gurus, particularly the 10 which remained from Ocean's 11, although actually it was less than 10. By 1986. Each of these two warring factions, however, also had sub-factions within them. As such, there were actually 4 factions vying for supremacy. One of these 4 would have to prevail, and that was to be decided in 1986 and verified in 1987. If the established faction, which was Ocean's 11 and its hatchet men, sycophants, and vested interests, was able to overcome the reformers, then it would remain, although somewhat weakened, as at the top of the turtle tank in its own version of so-called no change. That still seemed quite likely in 1985. However, by 1986, it appeared to be less so. It might not prevail. So let us call this faction of the 4, let us call it status quo. Obviously, the historical record proves to us that it produced the first transformation of the late 70s and therefore launched the Upasampradaya known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. Status quo was still in power in early 1986. It controlled the vitiated GBC, and the majority of air quotes ISKCON devotees remained bamboozled by it. However, within it, there was another faction. This faction, or sub-faction, agreed with the status quo more than it did not agree with it. Nevertheless, its chief point of contention was a desire to expand the number of air quotes ISKCON gurus. Now, as you may know, a handful had been added to Ocean's 11 beginning in 1982, and 2 had been dropped out. Status quo didn't like the idea that more would be added, but it was willing to accept that. A minor expansion could be tolerated. But the 11 great pretenders, already whittled down due to Jayatirtha's and Hangsadutta's defections, did not want their scheme challenged. If a mass of newer gurus was approved by this otherwise loyal guard within the first transformation, then the zonal scheme would necessarily be jeopardized. So this was the position of the second group, which we're going to call status quo modified. They accepted that Uttama worship of the gurus of so-called ISKCON must continue. They accepted the pranam mantras and concocted labels still were to be a part of the program. But they wanted the number of gurus to increase, which obviously was self-motivated to no small extent. Status quo considered them the loyal opposition, and they were that. Nevertheless, these two constituted what should be seen in retrospect as an in-house struggle, a milder version of the real fratricidal war. And then there was Ravindra's group. Professor Blue Blood wrote the position paper on, quote-unquote, this was the title, Ending the Fratricidal War. But somehow, ironically, that treatise and a follow-up was only the opening shot across the bow. As already mentioned, this warring faction of the reformists was also divided, although that internal division would mostly not be recognized as such in late 1986. It would be fully recognized in the next year, just previous to the Mayapur annual conclave of 1987, where many changes were made. We shall thus speak of the war of the mid-80s as four groups, vying for control of the governing body. Besides being called the Guru Reform Movement, this third group, headed by Ravindra, can more accurately be called compromise reform. It did not want to draw any hard lines which it knew the status quo, as well as status quo modified, would fight to the bitter end. Now, Ravindra called his movement a revolution, but it was never any such thing. It was always nothing more than a proposed reform amounting only to another transformation if and when it got over. It would be different from status quo, but it would not confront the root issues of the deviations that opened Pandora's box and launched the institutional catastrophe just after Prabhupada left the scene. Yet there was a subgroup within the Guru Reform Movement, which, by the way, the name for that is an absurd anachronism and a misnomer if there ever was one. So this subgroup would eventually oppose compromise reform. The subgroup, they were also party men, second and third echelon loyalists to the institution. But they were unwilling to compromise on the issue of initiation of the post-1977 newcomers. Was this one actually revolutionary? Of course not, because it wanted everything to still work through the GBC. In other words, it did not recognize that the GBC had been the chief scourge since Prabhupada's disappearance from material manifestation. However, in one way, and one way only, this group was tapping into a raw nerve, as its members demanded that all the new disciples throughout the movement be informed that none of them had received a genuine initiation since joining in late 1977. We shall label this fourth faction radical reform. In summary, in 1986, the four contenders vying for, air quotes, ISKCON supremacy, which would have to include control of the vitiated GBC, were 1. Status quo, 2. Status quo modified, 3. Compromise reform, and 4. Radical reform. Now, you may object that the fourth group should not have the adjective radical applied to it. This objection would be legitimate if it stood for a revolution. But because it was only advocating reform, the adjective remains applicable and acceptable in that context. All four of these factions had strong arguments. Which would win? In today's presentation, we continue with our running review of Henry Doktorsky's manuscript, his second book of 12 total, entitled 11 Naked Emperors. This is his most important work to date, in the opinion of your host speaker. It will be referenced by its acronym ENE throughout this presentation. We have now reached Chapter 12, which basically centers around the pivotal year of 1986. The chapter is entitled, quote-unquote, Preparing for Battle. To some extent, that is accurate, since the conclusion of the war between the four factions would only be known in 1987, which was also a contentious year. However, the battle was already fully engaged in 1986. The preparatory battle stage was throughout late 1984 and all of 1985. There's no need to quibble about chapter titles, but your host speaker still chooses to mention it. Let us now segue to some excerpts related to the historical narrative as presented by ENE in Chapter 12. Quote, the public revelation in August 1985 that Bhavananda had tried to seduce a teenage boy gave the members of the Guru reform movement renewed determination to dethrone the zonal acharyas, unquote. In 1986, that determination increased exponentially as Bhavananda's status had been suspended and he could no longer be guru or initiate new disciples. His fanatical disciples in Australia were greatly displeased by this punishment, and they were materially productive. And they were also loose like him. When it came to enjoying sensual opportunities they could easily create for themselves in the cult atmosphere in which they operated and controlled. They threatened to crater the whole Australian yatra if Bhavananda was not reinstated at that Mayapur conclave in the spring of 1986. And they had the power to do that. And as could only be expected, the vitiated GBC capitulated to them. Quote, the powerful influence of the establishment was manifest when the GBC reinstated Bhavananda as a guru in good standing, although he had been suspended only 6 months earlier after being confronted with an allegation of homosexual activities with a teenage brahmachari in Vrindavan, India, an allegation to which he confessed to guilt. A pretender acharya confessed to having homosexual relations with a minor, and within 6 months, he was considered completely pure and able to initiate disciples. The temple presidents were appalled, unquote. The vitiated GBC did not share to the devotees at large what the final vote was to allow Bhavananda back into the club, but the scuttlebutt was that it was razor thin. Apparently, he made it by only 1 vote. Except for the Australian leaders, almost all the other presidents were deeply disturbed by this GBC capitulation. ENE relates how one of them, Yashomathinandan, the leader in Gujarat, was particularly appalled. Quote, we all went back to our temples with our hearts broken and hopes shattered, having given Lord Chaitanya a wonderful gift of a faggot guru in his parampara on his 500th appearance day. We were absolutely convinced our leaders were destroying ISKCON, unquote. Of course, so-called ISKCON had already replaced and killed the real ISKCON movement by that time. However, those still operating in the cult refused to recognize that, except now it was dawning on them just what was going down. And this particular example of Bhavananda, that corruption was mind-boggling. As could only have been expected, the vitiated GBC, representing status quo, rejected Ravindra's latest position paper entitled Under My Order, Reflections of the Guru in ISKCON. This was, of course, the treatise that bucked up against Kirtanananda's quote-unquote on my order in the confrontation at Moundsville in 1985. However, due to Bhavananda's brouhaha, there was now momentum generated for status quo modified. Quote, also at the March GBC meetings, the GBC gave official approval for 26 senior Prabhupada disciples to begin initiating disciples, unquote. That was from E&E. Of these 26, one of them was Ravindra, but he actually got his guru approval the previous September at Moundsville. They needed to buy him off. Now they considered that not just him, but all of his backers, allies, and potential allies needed some kind of institutional encouragement. In 1986, the zones were made more or less irrelevant, and so-called ISKCON was going for guru numbers, abandoning any idea of exclusivity completely. In doing so, it was implicating as many second and third echelon men as possible in its deviations. Compromise reform demanded more than this, however. It appeared that status quo modified won, but the question is, would status quo modified actually prevail in 1986? There was another modification that was passed in the spring of 1986 by the vitiated GBC. It was how gurus at any local temples throughout the world would be worshipped. It would now be determined by the temple presidents, not by GBC mandate. If the presidents chose to do so, they could restrain the undeserved Uttama Adhikari worship of the high-profile acharyas, particularly the ones who remained from Ocean's 11 in 1978. And as could easily have been predicted, the so-called Vyasasan at Ramanreti inside the Krishna Balaram Mandir was removed. Indeed, the word got around that immediately after Mayapur in 1986, the devotees at that Ramanreti Mandir threw that so-called Vyasasan out of a second-story window in order to watch it shatter into pieces. Yet, these changes did not satisfy the Guru reform movement very much. They demanded more than this. Status quo modified prevailed at Mayapur in 1986, but that was not the end of the story. The prominent gurus, along with the new gurus who strongly backed them and in many cases imitated them, still controlled the vitiated GBC, and Bhavananda was a short-term winner, but a big-time festering sore soon thereafter. A comment I made about the scandal via a later email to Doktorsky was shared by him in Chapter 12. Quote, with such a high percentage of new gurus being exposed for scandalous behavior, the 1986 GBC should have acted with dispatch to reverse the whole scheme. It should have realized the importance of genuine guru, which none of the 11 were, as well as none of the other elected men later. None of them were gurus because Prabhupada said, regular guru, that's all, but that's not what they did. In other words, unquote, by the way, in other words, simply tweaking the protocol by allowing the presidents to determine whether or not their guru of the zone or a visiting new guru could or would receive or would not receive pompous worship did not constitute anything remotely near a root course connection of the real problem haunting so-called ISKCON since 1978. For much of 1986, your host speaker was the treasurer and chief lecturer at the Berkeley Center in California. Many of the devotees there respected me, and some of them questioned me when the word reached us about what went down in Mayapur that spring. We had all been cooperating with Atreya Rishi, the local GBC, and Trivikram Swami, the local sannyasi. All of us were part of the Guru Reform movement. I was, of course, a radical reformer, but I mostly, although not entirely, kept that to myself. We did not think that Atreya and Trivikram would, in effect, sell us out like that. We thought wrong. Atreya was immediately made into a, air quotes, ISKCON initiating guru, and Trivikram was put on a 1-year wait in the queue to be automatically approved as Diksha Guru if he remained scandal-free when Mayapur 1987 rolled around, which he did. Those who liked me at Berkeley considered all of what we were then informed about to be a betrayal. When we got this news about what went down, I drew up a concise petition condemning the GBC. We considered Mayapur 1986 to be a massive expansion of deviant Diksha Guru by vote, combined with Bhavananda's sexual exploits swept under the rug via readmitting him to the, air quotes, ISKCON Guru Club. We considered all of it to be a betrayal of Prabhupada, and most of the devotees there in Berkeley put their necks out and signed the petition. Atreya and Trivikram were confronted with an active beehive's nest of discontent when they returned to the Bay Area in April. From E&E, quote, I was in Berkeley at that time, and when we heard that Atreya Rishi and Trivikram had sold us out and accepted a guru appointment, I created and circulated a petition against the GBC, which virtually all of the members of the Berkeley Temple signed, unquote. The movement had degenerated into a kind of oligarchy that even resembled, to some limited and incomplete degree, a form of fascism. Many of its devotees could no longer sincerely believe in it. They were internally horrified by what was going down. Yet they took a risk if they chose to express any of that in an open way. The demand for loyalty and humility by the zonals of the top echelon on the devotees at large was very oppressive. That top hierarchy was loaded with hypocrisy, in no small measure because it was itself utterly devoid of humility. That created a kind of institutional parody, a satire, as a once spiritual institution had become anything but. The lifting of the suspension of Bhavananda and his provisional reinstatement as Diksha Guru was the most obvious gas fueling discontent amongst the temple presidents. Their anger was being supercharged, and the zonal scheme was not holding. The center if you consider the center of so-called ISKCON to be its vitiated GBC, was not holding either. Expanding the number of Diksha gurus weakened the zonal arrangement. The guru principalities were thus losing any meaning. Bhavananda becoming free of his suspension, along with his provisional reinstatement as Diksha Guru in his zone, was resolved on unsound, shaky, emotional grounds. The expansion of gurus, along with Bhavananda being dealt with so permissively, was spelling an end to status quo. And then it became obvious that status quo modified gave way to compromise reform. Actually, the historical record is that Bhavananda was still checked to some limited degree, and rightfully so. His probation was lifted, but he was not allowed to initiate new disciples in it until October of that year. He had to keep his nose clean for another 6 months. As it turned out, he didn't. In so-called ISKCON, an institutional guru was considered automatically good unless caught in a deviation. That rubber stamp was still in full effect in the spring of 1986. Bhavananda had been caught the previous year, but he got provisionally reinstated nevertheless. Kirtanananda had not been caught yet. So the underlying institutional hypocrisy was practically all-pervasive at a foundational level. Although previously this realization had been subconscious, it was not entirely so by this point. So-called ISKCON was without real honesty, but such had been the case for years. Cheaters, all of them. But not all of them had been caught yet in a flagrant act of cheating. There were indications that Bhavananda had not brought himself back up to the standard, and that was demanded of him. He was ordered at a San Diego GBC meeting in August 1986 not to travel any longer with his young disciple and male companion Bala. The purport of that order is quite self-evident. His guru reinstatement was not yet solidified. The zones, the Acharya zones, were becoming shaky entities. As such, the zonal divisions had been reaffirmed at Mayapur 1986. They had to do that because obviously those zones were no longer fully effective. Some token concessions, besides the expansion of gurus, were made to the temple presidents in relation to vyasasans, photographic placements of guru pictures on altars, and how the altars were to be arranged. This amounted to nothing much. Technically, 17 men, led by Ravindra, had been given preliminary approval to be Diksha Gurus at Moundsville in 1985, and they all were fully approved, reaffirmed, at Mayapur 1986. 7 more received full approval at that conclave. 6 more so-called advanced devotees, led by Trivikram, were put on a 1-year list to wait in queue. As such, a total of 30 new gurus were either institutionally activated or soon to be actuated as per GBC rubber stamp in the spring of 1986. The GBC insisted that it was not making new gurus via this method because authorization was allegedly not the same as appointing or creating gurus. This was and remains very weak logic. What is the real difference between making and authorizing? And that question I just asked you is a rhetorical question. Another change was a new rule applicable to how someone became an institutional guru in so-called ISKCON. A new GBC mandate required a potential candidate for guru to be presented by at least one GBC man, the minimum requirement. A vote was then taken by the whole GBC, If the majority did not object to the nomination, he was put on a 1-year queue, after which he was recognized as a full-fledged Diksha Guru. The No 3 Blackballs Protocol of 1985 was thus abandoned. Tattvamasi. Superficially, it appeared that the issue of fairness was at the core of this Guru expansion ploy, but that was not the case. It was politics, plain and simple. It was a compromise which kept radical reform in check. The radical reformers, what to speak of the revolutionaries outside the cult, were disappointed by what went down at Mayapur. Subsequently, in this presentation, we shall present details about the assassination of Sulochan in the 4th week of May 1986. What I'm just going to mention now is a prelude. Everyone knew that Kirtanananda was behind the hit and authorized it. He was a recognized, air quotes, ISKCON guru, but now we're talking about murder. It was a scandal that required damage control at a different level. Murder is not what saintly gurus are supposed to be implicated in. Compromise reform, which turned out to be the 1986 triumphant party, received fresh impetus to rein in wildcard gurus, especially since one of them proved capable of ordering hits on malcontents. ISKCON opponents was not part of, air quotes, ISKCON protocol. After the assassination of Sulochan, Kirtanananda was not institutionally removed as a Diksha Guru from so-called ISKCON. However, steps were taken by the vitiated GBC to remove him. A GBC representative received a verbal promise from Kirtanananda via a telephone conversation that he, Kirtanananda, would resign from the GBC, which would also mean that his guru status would be revoked, if he was named as a co-conspirator in indictments for either the murder of Sulochan or Chakrathari or both. 2 other gurus were exposed in the summer of 1986. Bhagavan resigned as GBC and left his zone to run away with a female disciple. Rameshvara, disguised by a wig and dressed in karmic clothes, was accidentally seen, read caught, by one of his godbrothers at a Southern California mall holding hands with a female teenager, probably his disciple. As could only be expected, the Sulochan murder shook up the whole of the movement. The North American Temple Presidents, acronym NATPA, called for an emergency meeting in Chicago, mostly to request, read demand, that Kirtanananda be removed from so-called ISKCON. Now that's the prelude. Let's get into the assassination itself, which is covered in Chapter 12 of ENE. In the wee hours of May 22nd, 1986, Sulochan had parked and turned off the engine of his Dodge van, which he slept in, near an abandoned trestle bridge within a mile of Watseka Avenue. Watseka Avenue was the chief place of action in so-called ISKCON in Los Angeles, and the temple complex was and remains located on it. There is evidence that Sulochan had enjoyed himself at the house of one of his godbrothers who lived on a street close to the temple. The man who would murder him had discovered Sulochan's van parked at that godbrother's house. The man who would end up murdering him was prepared to find the best spot for an ambush when Sulochan decided to call it a night and drive away somewhere nearby. At 00:57 in Culver City, California, on the night of May 22nd, Sulochan was sitting in the driver's seat of his old Dodge van. According to Doktorsky's research in a previous book, Sulochan was rolling a joint. Unknown to the manhunters pursuing him, Sulochan had given up his campaign against Kirtanananda and the vitiated GBC, which still backed, quote-unquote, Bhaktipad. While living in the mountains near Badger, California, Sulochan had found a new devotee girlfriend. Her mother, who backed his cause, approved of him, a handsome 33-year-old man who was also well-built and interested in starting a family. Sulochan saw no hope in getting his children back from a previous marriage, and he had no longer any interest, either sexually or otherwise, in his former wife, who was fully dedicated to his arch-nemesis, Kirtanananda. That air quotes ISKCON guru had started the whole ball rolling by, without Sulochan's consent, initiating his wife against Sulochan's will. He was now going to start a new life, but the demigods had other plans. The astral situation at that time was extremely inauspicious. The moon was conjunct malefic Ketu in Libra. The lunar phase, known as a Titi, was the third worst possible. It was the 14th Titi of the waxing moon. It was night, and evil planets are stronger at night than during the day. At 00:57 on May 22nd, malefic Mars was in the 12th, the house of loss. The ascendant, Capricorn, was ruled by retrograde Saturn in the sign of revenge, Scorpio. Saturn was casting his full 7th house aspect on the Sun, who is lord of the 8th, the house of death. The moon was fully under the aspect of Rahu. Mercury is the planetary karaka for writing and communication. For most of 1985, Mercury was not combust and working for the young man. But that night, Buddha was completely wiped out by the sun. Sulochan had lost his mojo. He wasn't writing anymore. As a result, his sporadic brilliance as a writer was compromised, and he had descended into intoxication, which is ruled by Rahu. Sulochan had transformed his attack on Kirtanananda to that of becoming a vociferous critic of the zonal acharyas, including Rameshwar. Rameshwar had hatchet men, and his bodyguards were similar in their killer mentalities to the wicked enforcers which Kirtanananda had employed at Moundsville in West Virginia. One of those manhunters, a Vietnam vet named Thomas Drescher, was a disciple of Kirtanananda. His Vedic name was Tirtha. He was there in Culver City that night. He had tracked his prey and was ready to act. Kirtanananda and Rameshwar had reasons to be paranoid about Sulochan, but that's a long story. Sulochan was now in Rameshwar's zone, very close to where Rameshwar was living and within striking range. Rameshwar had warned Sulochan that he would be, quote-unquote, dead meat if he did not return all of Prabhupada's letters, copies of which he had obtained by surreptitious means through the agency of a godbrother who had access to them. Sulochan was not going to give any of those back, especially since potent excerpts from them were the basis of his upcoming expose entitled The Guru Business, which your host speaker had edited for him the previous summer. The wrong idea that the Raman Reti room conversation of May 28, 1977 had allegedly established 11 successors to Prabhupada would be exposed by Sulochan via his commentaries on the partial transcript of that room conversation. He would accomplish far more than that in his book, which was on the verge of being published. He would not live to see that, however, because he would be assassinated that night, 9 years after, almost to the date, of that important room conversation in India. In Chapter 12, E&E reveals the following. Quote, Sulochan began writing a book about his findings, but he discovered he was not a writer. He badly needed an editor. Sulochan contacted a Brahmin godbrother who is not only highly regarded as a scholar, but also as one who had battled against the zonal acharyas in 1979, Kailāsa Candra. The two traveled together in Sulochan's van for 3 months during the summer of 1985, during which time Kailāsa Candra edited Sulochan's manuscript, The Guru Business, unquote. Sulochan fancying himself a Kshatriya warrior, but he was no match at any level to Drescher. Tirtha was an accomplished killer in Southeast Asia, had already murdered a devotee, Chakrathari, at the Moundsville compound, and was being paid to kill Sulochan. Drescher also had backup with him when he advanced upon Sulochan's van that night. Sulochan had ran his mouth off about the violence he hoped to carry out on the Gurus, but never did. Despite his change of mentality, the lag effect of what he said before that was still attached to him on the psychophysical plane, and he had to pay the price for it. As already mentioned, the planets were unfavorable to him that Wednesday night, which is ruled by Mercury, who is completely wiped out. E&E mentions Sulochan's effort as follows, quote, Sulochan began a smear campaign against Kirtanananda and the other zonal gurus, and went so far as to suggest that violence was an acceptable method for removing the zonal acharyas from power. Sulochan, who had a Kshatriya spirit, sharpened his marksmanship skills on a target range by shooting a pistol at a picture of his arch nemesis, Kirtanananda, unquote. Shared by E&E, here is a direct quote from Sulochan. Quote, Sulochan explained, Kirtanananda lived by violence. He personally authorized so much physical violence against his godbrothers and godsisters that it was no surprise to us that his punishment also came by violence. By failing to rectify themselves at New Vrindavan on September 16th, these gurus more or less declared open season on themselves, and they had no one else to blame. It was only a matter of time before each guru is dead or wishes he were. This is just a fact of life. Their fate is sealed by their own actions, unquote. There are indications that a number of American temple presidents were aware that Sulochan wanted to execute mortal force against what remained of the original 11 zonals. In turn, some of those gurus wanted the same fate for Sulochan. In E&E, Rameshwar is quoted as follows, quote, Sulochan should be given a new body, unquote. An accomplished female disciple of Rameshwar who worked at the ISKCON Public Relations Department under Mukunda in Los Angeles had somehow or other negotiated a friendly relationship with Sulochan whenever he was in the area. She is quoted in E&E as follows, quote, as far as I know, Sulochan wanted to kill all of the gurus, unquote. Ravindra was of the opinion, not without evidence, that Sulochan had shifted his focus to violence to Rameshwar from Kirtanananda, who is heavily guarded at his Moundsville compound. E&E quotes Professor Blueblood as follows, quote, he wanted to assassinate Kirtanananda but decided it was too hard, and instead said he was going to try and assassinate Rameshwar. So there were Rameshwar security agents kind of following this guy around. He was in disguise, going from place to place, and then some people came from New Vrindavan to help them. One of them was a guy by the name of Tirtha, who had been trained as a killer by the United States government in Vietnam, so he had valuable skills, unquote. Drescher creeped up on Sulochan's van undetected and fired 2 bullets into his head at point-blank range. It is certain that Sulochan died instantly and possibly became a ghost, as sudden and violent death often results in the astral body remaining on earth. No conditioned soul can know for sure about that, but it is certain that Sulochan let his guard down, and that carelessness cost him his life. Let us summarize chapter 12 as follows. There were key entities, read submovements, and personalities, which or who dominated so-called ISKCON throughout 1986. The question is, was there one person who was integral to or implicated in all of them? There was all that centered around Bhavananda, and we have covered much of that. Was there a prominent personality who worked to not only expose Bhavananda, but to make him the centerpiece of discontent? There was the Guru Reform movement. Did one person not only dominate it, but by his position papers more or less inaugurate it? There was the North American Temple Presidents Association, NATPA. Was there one person who was most prominent in it? There was the vitiated GBC. It added a new member the previous year who was then privy to what was going on in its contentious meetings. Who was that special individual? Did he also qualify in the other categories just mentioned? The GBC made a substantial number of new initiating gurus in the spring of 1986. Was there one of them who got preliminary approval to be an, air quotes, ISKCON Diksha Guru the year before, and then got fully rubber-stamped as Guru by the Commish in 1986? Taking into account all of these lateral octaves operative in so-called ISKCON in that fateful year, is there one man, and one man only, who is integrally involved in every single one of these categories? The answer is in the affirmative, and you all know that answer. That fellow was the man in so-called ISKCON in 1986. He was at the top of the institution's turtle tank. His name and title is Professor William Deadwyler III, a.k.a. Ravindra Svarupa Das Adhikari. Over and above all of these inclusions, Ravindra accomplished something else. You could argue that he did so the following year in 1987, but to a very significant extent, he actually accomplished its leading edge, without question, in 1986. He changed so-called ISKCON. Kali Yuga required a change, not a revolution, a change. And Professor Blueblood was Kali's agent in order to accomplish it. Ravindra was the inspiration, the seed, the director of the collegiate compromise, also known as the Second Transformation. The details of how this came about will be discussed in next month's presentation by your host speaker, which will, as already indicated, center on 1987. Yet it behooves me now to mention that the Second Transformation was a complete disaster in terms of any hope of Prabhupada's international movement returning to square one. There was a slight chance for this in 1986. That chance was snuffed out by Professor Blueblood. He wanted a kinder, gentler, so-called ISKCON, free from zonal tyrants. He accomplished that with his collegiate compromise, but he did so by ignoring this obvious truth. A bogus guru cannot transmit a genuine Vaishnava initiation. We shall cover all of it threadbare next month. Compromise reform was the winner in 1986, and that fact did not change the next year. Compromise reform was Ravindra's baby, and he took full responsibility for it and full advantage of it. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. Prabhupada warned us, quote, "If there is lack of knowledge, or if there is forgetfulness, everything will be spoiled in time," unquote. It didn't take much time for ISKCON to be converted into so-called ISKCON. It has been a semblance of a spiritual institution for decades, a movement where victory in the turtle tank and political competition to fulfill personal ambition replaces advancement through the perfect knowledge of Krishna consciousness, is what so-called ISKCON is now. Sadeva Saumya.